All right, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the Disaster Preparedness webinar series. Today's topic is tree management before and after disaster. We thank you for taking your time to join us this afternoon. My name is Russell Medley, and I will be moderating today's session. If you weren't able to join us last week, Taylor Lauscher talked about where to go to access foods during a disaster event, in addition to providing us information on food insecurity and how disasters can impact our health. So before we begin, there's just a few housekeeping items that I need to share. In an effort to allow the session to run smoothly, we have muted all participants and ask that you don't use your video. Today's session is being recorded, and we will send this out to everyone who is registered following the series. If you would like to ask questions, use the chat feature during today's presentation. You may also wait until the end of the presentation to ask questions. I'd like to introduce our speaker today. Her name is Emily Swihart, and she is the Horticulture Educator for Illinois Extension, serving the counties of Henry, Mercer, Rock Island, and Stark in Northwest Illinois. So with that, Emily, go ahead.
Thank you, Russell. I'm going to make sure everyone can share my screen. If you can't, let me know in the chat box. I'm going to turn my camera off. All right. Well, first, thank you all for joining us today as we talk about the weather-related disasters and the impact that they can have on the trees in our lives. We have some unpredictable weather in the Midwest, and you have heard from my colleagues in the previous sessions of this series that these threats and occurrences of natural disasters has increased with the effects of climate change, and they continue to change and evolve. And so being prepared for what may come is only going to have us more prepared to weather these storms figuratively and literally. Just a bit of background or a little bit of summary. So we set the stage for why we are concerned about preparing for these storms is that according to a report and an assessment for the impacts of climate change in Illinois, the impacts of climate change are already being felt around the world, including here in Illinois. And in this report, it noted that the weather is significantly warmer and wetter than it has been at any other time in the last 120 years. And these changes are likely to continue. It's predicted that we are going to have more frequent heat waves. Summer nights are going to be warmer. We're going to have increased precipitation in the winter months and spring months. And then the summer months are going to be drier. And this is going to impact everything from economy to public health to our trees and the plants in our lives. And so we want to consider what we can do to best prepare. So each of these changes has the potential to significantly impact our trees, and a tree's health is directly going to impact its resiliency in the face of these disasters. And so more heat waves, warmer nights, drier summers, increase the potential for drought stress in plants. Wetter winters increase potential for heavy snow or ice loads accumulating on our plants and potentially causing damage or branch failure. Climate change is a continue to change like the hydrology or the water systems in our landscapes. And so this has already been observed with like rivers experiencing more flooding. Adjacent to these waterways or river systems are trees in our landscape. And so how is that going to affect plants and the root systems? And then just beyond the impacts of climate change, like what are some of the other threats that we're seeing, especially during the growing season, particularly like strong storms, winds, derecho is a phrase that we all have learned and has become part of our nomenclature of late. These are all things that we live with in the Midwest. So how do we help our trees get ready for them? Well, just like preparing your finances, your food systems, your being prepared to take care of your family before the storm hits, we need to be taking care of our trees. And that is our best chance at helping them weather these storms. Luck favors the prepared, right? And so we want to help prepare ourselves and our trees to weather these events. So to do that, it starts with planting trees. Long before you can consider how trees are going to withstand storm events or weather changes, you have to have trees in your landscape to begin with. And so we need to be concerned about putting the right tree in the right place. What this means is that you are looking at site characteristics and comparing it to tree characteristics or species characteristics and choosing what is going to fit fit together in the best way so that that tree can be healthy, it can be long-lived, the management can be minimized, both for human impacts, but then also it's going to be best for a tree if they're let to do what trees do, which is to grow naturally. So the right tree in the right place. Considering site characteristics. These are things like your climate or grow zone. So the USDA has a map. You can find it on their website. It's called the Plant Hardiness Zones, and it's a colored map. It's got a lot of beautiful colors on it, but basically what it is illustrating is the average minimum temperatures that we experience in any given area. So in Illinois, we've got from the far northwest corner of Illinois, that has a 5A rating, the very northwest. So that's the coldest average winter temperature that we will see in Illinois. And then all the way down to the far southern areas of Illinois, we reach down to a 7A. The numbers are based on 10-degree changes. The letters are on 5-degree temperature changes in the winter, average low temperatures. So considering if your tree can withstand those cold winter temperatures is going to be one of the factors that we're utilizing to select species. Soil. Looking at the soil that you're going to be planting into, there are a variety of different soil conditions from sandy, loam, well-drained soils that are going to have water run through it. They're going to have not a lot of impediments for root development, to clay soils that are going to retain water at a much higher capacity. They might be more challenging for roots to penetrate into and spread out. You might have compacted soils, sites like what we see here, where this is along a road corridor where you could be pretty sure that that site has been influenced by some sort of construction activity, be it the sidewalk or that driveway or the road or the installment of that utility line. That soil has been disturbed and there might be some compaction there. Noting the utilities, you would want to pay attention to those. In our built environment, we have a lot of utilities that are existing that are going to need maintenance, that could influence tree development and potentially interfere with trees. This picture I like because it shows what was done right. You see the larger trees off to the right-hand side. There's a little bit of pruning that has been done on them. You can see to limit the interference of that power line with those tree canopies. But this crabapple here is a lower growing, smaller size species, and probably one of the smaller size selections of the crabapples. There's a variety of selections that are available, and the sizes range on those, but this tree will likely not grow to the point where it interferes with that power line in an unmanageable way. And so that's a wise choice, because power lines and trees just do not play well together. Also, utilities and hardscapes would include things like that sidewalk, like that roadway. The root systems need a place to go and grow. And so by evaluating the hardscapes that are around, those sites can help you determine the size of the tree that is going to be able to be supported in that location. Existing plantings impact what trees you're going to be putting in a site. And then also maintenance. What do you have available in terms of time to care for these newly planted trees? What are they going to require? If you're forcing a tree that is not well suited for an area into a certain site because you really love that species, or maybe we just didn't know any better, that can increase the level of maintenance that is going to be required. And maintenance is important, and I'm talking about these young trees because, again, a healthy, well-developed tree in the long term, especially once it gets to be a mature size, is going to be better able to withstand the impacts of storm. And so it might seem counterintuitive to be talking about trees that are just newly planted, but trees are long-lived, and so we want to be thinking about the end game here with trees and farther into the future. So then after evaluating the site, you're going to be looking at your species selection. And so some of the considerations, I've mentioned a few of these before, but we'll go back to that size, that overall size. How big is a tree going to grow in the future, right? We're planting smaller trees generally, between like 5 and maybe 8 foot in size. A nice size container tree would be planted. It's not going to stay that size. These bald cypress here are massive. you know, considering, you know, looking into the future, 10, 15, 50 years, how large is that tree going to get? And is the site providing enough space for it to grow? The growth habit of that species, so knowing if it's more of a spreading tree, if it's a columnar, you know, tall, narrow tree, can help influence what you're going to be planting, where you're going to be planting it, and then the maintenance that is going to be required. Again, if you're forcing a tree into a location that is just not well suited for it, that can cause some challenges later on. And so acknowledging what the growth habit would be, the natural growth habit would be for that tree, is going to help inform your decision. And then tolerances and resistances. So I'd mentioned some cultivars, especially crabapple. Earlier, there are cultivars and there are selections of trees made that will help or that have been shown to demonstrate resistance to certain diseases, certain insects or fungal pathogens, bacterial pathogens. Selecting for those resistance cultivars can help you have a healthier tree in the long run, right? It's not going to be as stressed out by having, you know, some sort of abiotic attack, you know, on it. Then the tolerances would be like site condition tolerances. We talked about soils before, but this can go even farther than that, which is, do we have a soil that has a high pH? Do we have a soil that's going to have, you know, runoff or have snow load pushed off from it, which often will have de-icing salts in it, and that can be a challenge for some plants to grow. And so considering what the site is going to be providing both now and in the long term, and what those trees can tolerate or what they're going to be either prone to or resistant to, can help make better choices. Light requirements. All plants need some level of light to perform photosynthesis. We know this. Some trees tolerate shade better than others. And so assessing your light requirements or your light availability in your backyard, in your community, in your park, wherever you're managing or wherever you're planting your trees, can help inform your decision. And then known problems. You know, recently, emerald ash borer has been a challenge with our ash trees, with all the fraxinus. And so knowing that there are challenges with that species would help us perhaps choose not to plant it. It's not recommended that we plant ash trees, but knowing about some challenges that plants are experiencing can help influence our planting decisions and then our maintenance down the road. And then, you know, finally, the maintenance requirements and the attributes. We've mentioned those before about the level of maintenance that is going to be required and that is available. Because if you don't have the availability of maintenance, you're not going to be able to raise a healthy, resilient tree as best as you could. So planting and establishment, I'm just going to run through a few of these things really quickly, because this can, you know, whether if you put the right tree in the right place, you've done all your homework, you've chosen the right, you know, you've gotten all your I's dotted and T's crossed, and then we plant the tree too deep, or we plant it and we don't, you know, tend to it afterwards, that can be equally as detrimental to the overall health and establishment of that tree. And so I'm going to play a quick video here that shows the excavation of a root ball that I got. This is a honey locust tree. I was planting it, and you can see the amount of soil that I'm taking off of the top of that root ball. What I'm pointing to there is the graft union. So the top of that tree was grafted to a different tree's rootstock, and that's just so that we can have consistency in the canopy. But what we have right there is what's called the first lateral root. That is what you should be planting. That is the proper planting depth for a tree. And I like this video because it illustrates how deep that tree would have been buried had I buried it at the soil level that I got it right out of the nursery. I took off, you know, about 3 inches of that soil material. That first lateral root is what should be at the surface of your soil or higher. It should not be planted any deeper than that. And so proper planting depth would be at that first lateral root, which is the first significant root that you see. And then afterwards, mulching and watering your tree. So mulch is going to provide a value or a number of benefits for you and for the tree. So first, for the tree, mulch helps to compete with weeds in and around that planting hole. So you don't want to have turf grass planted right up to your tree. That turf grass is going to compete for water and nutrient resources. It's also going to help keep mowers away from your tree. Mowers and weed whips and any sort of damaging tools to the trunk of the tree can be detrimental to the long-term health of your tree. And so from a tree's perspective, keeping a nice ring, donut-shaped ring of mulch around the base of a tree can be beneficial. From a management standpoint on our end, it can help retain some of that moisture that we're going to want to be providing our trees, supplemental water. It's important to water trees after they've been planted because you think of the trees where they're coming from. So they're often coming from a nursery setting where they have been well cared for. They have been provided with adequate water and moisture, moisture over their growing, the life of the tree. And then we take it and we put it out into the harsh environment of our community, of our backyard, of our boulevards, of the world. And we don't always have adequate rainfall, right? We have competing resources. Maybe it's just the soil around the area pulling moisture away from that root ball. And then that compounded with the shock that a tree can go through, it's can be minimized by providing supplemental water in that transplant shock. So when the tree goes from the nursery into its final growing space, there can be a little bit of shock. And so providing adequate water to the tree can help minimize that shock. So then what do you have if you've already got trees? We've already got existing trees in our landscape, large mature trees, or you've already, maybe they're not the size of this tree here, but they are in the ground, and you are responsible for caring for them. So how do we evaluate these trees? Well, it's important to evaluate trees so that you can get ahead of any potential challenges that the trees are going to be experiencing. Again, healthy trees and well-structured trees are going to be better able to withstand storms and natural disasters or what comes at it. And so by monitoring or by assessing your trees, you can take action, when there's a health issue. So like I said earlier, different things that can impact trees when they're planted or as they mature are things like soil compaction, drought, moisture fluctuations, temperature extremes, mechanical injuries. A lot of times large trees are interfere with any sort of mechanical or vehicular traffic or movement or a house. Sometimes they'll grow into building conditions. Sometimes there is a graft incompatibility. So sometimes you'll start seeing some issues happen at that graft union. Damage to the root zone can occur. And so all these things need to be evaluated and monitored over time so that then action can be taken. So to give an example of how some of these things might change for an established tree. So like temperature extremes, you can't do much about. You can, if we have a really hot, dry period, providing supplemental water, for those large trees can help them withstand that heat, that dry zone or that dry time period. Changes in moisture or drainage patterns that can be influenced by construction around the site. So maybe some grading took place off the site and now there's more water coming towards the tree, or maybe there's less water coming towards a tree. Both of those things can influence the health of a tree. Construction in the area, not protecting the root zone can cause compaction. It can minimize, some of the roots available for the tree, and that can show up as signs of stress up in the canopy. And so monitoring for those things ahead of time can help you mitigate. Scouting for symptoms and signs. These would be things like, pests or diseases or insects. I think I've got a slide here coming up that talks a little bit more about those in depth, but you'll see my final bullet point there. Like, there are professionals available for folks. If you're not comfortable doing this, if your familiarity with trees is not what you would desire it to be, it's an ISA certified arborist, International Society of Horticulture. It has a certification program. These folks are trained professionals. They have to pass a certification exam. They have to do continuing education. And so they are really well equipped to help you assess your tree, to monitor it, and then to recommend some treatment options if something is alarming. And so if you're doing it yourself, or if you're having a professional to help you, doing a risk management assessment can help you determine if the tree is hazardous. So I want to define hazard first. So a hazardous tree is one that has been deemed to be of threat to something, property or person. A tree in the back 40 that has some structural issues might not be considered hazardous unless it was the same tree along a boulevard where there's going to be kid traffic, walking home from school and cars parked and a house next to it. And so I want to just put that out there to begin with, because that's a pretty serious term. But we want to make sure that there is a target before we invest a lot of time and resource into managing some trees, and we allocate resources according. So some of the things that you would want to assess would be things that are potential failure for the tree. So this would be things like limbs that have died back, limbs that have the potential to drop in a storm event, or have broken and are at risk of falling on a target. Signs and symptoms of decay would also be assessed. And so these are like structural defects, or structural defects would include things like the bark being removed from a tree. This tree happened to be hit by lightning, and this is a very classic sign of a lightning strike, where the bark has been kind of thrown off the tree under the impact of that event. Narrow branch angles, this can happen on any trees. It can be narrow branch angles can be a weak point, and so that just means that they're going to be that one should maybe be addressed or removed, or some action should be taken to reduce some of the weight that is on that branch angle. Co-dominant leaders, I see this a lot. A lot of our trees have co-dominant or multiple dominant leaders. Again, that goes back to that branch angle. They're oftentimes have a narrow branch angle where they have met each other, and that's a point of potential failure. And then monitoring changes in your tree regularly, tracking for broken branches, dying branches, foliage that is not leafing out to the level that you would compare it to in the previous year, or is maybe not uniform all over the tree, would be signs that you would consider taking action. It may mean nothing at all, but you would want to monitor it regularly, both by making notes. So I like to take notes and record on in a notebook what I'm seeing happen to the trees, but then also photograph. We all have access to cameras nowadays, and it's very easy to store those images. You don't have to print them out or anything. But just have them on hand so you can visually see changes in the tree. It's a really useful tool as well. So also, while you're assessing trees, before doing any sort of diagnostics for biotic or abiotic issues, structurally you can kind of get away with not exactly knowing the species, but it is still helpful to know what species your tree is. That's kind of the first step in any sort of evaluation or diagnostic assessment. And so I have two photos here. These are conifers. You can see their thin leaves. They are not of the same species. We know that. And so the one on the left is the white pine. The one on the right is the dawn redwood, and that one looks like it's not doing so well, right? It's got some of those leaves are browning. They've got some tip dieback. It might be concerning. But since I just told you that that's a dawn redwood, and once you do your research and you learn about dawn redwoods, and you know that this conifer is one of our deciduous conifers, you would also know, or might want to know, that this photo was taken in October. And so this dawn redwood does this. This is a typical characteristic of the tree in October. It is going to lose its leaves. It is, like I said, deciduous. And so it's okay. This is not a sign of any sort of health issues. So identifying the species is going to help you know what is typical and what is atypical. If this was not typical for the dawn redwood, you would look for patterns. Abiotic, there's generally speaking, there's biotic and abiotic ailments. And so biotic issues are those that are caused by some sort of fungal, some bacteria, some sort of insect or pest, a living source of the issue. Generally, those are going to be seen in a random pattern throughout the tree. Many times there'll be some physical evidence of the pathogen, so like a fungal growth, a gall. You might even see the insect itself being present. On the other side is abiotic, which are environmental challenges or environmental issues that the tree would be responding to. This would be generally more uniform, and they would not have any sort of signs of a disease. So you would not see insects present. You would not see fungal fruiting bodies. Now, I tell you that, but I think it's also important to note that more than one thing could be going on with a tree. So that's important to keep in mind. It's oftentimes you will see more than one thing happening on a tree at a time. So it might not be an isolated event if something is concerning you about your tree. And then finally, for your specimen assessment, when you're assessing a tree, we've talked a lot about the foliage, we've talked about the branch structure. You want to look at the roots and the root zone as well. And I've got a whole slide on this, but we often just look up when many issues can be caused or can be attributed to the roots and the root zones of a tree. So let's take a look at that. So the roots are the anchoring source of a tree, right? They are also a nutrient and moisture uptake system. There's an exchange of nutrients of moisture between the canopy of the tree and the root zone. And so this is half of the tree that we should be managing. So to assess it, what you would want to do is you would want to start at the base of the tree, look for that root flare. This tree does not have it. A root flare is where there's like a buttress shape at the bottom of the tree where those roots start to spread out. These root zones can spread 3 to 5 times the spread of the canopy, and so that's going to be a significant portion of the land that you're looking at, but those roots will start to flare out. Above ground is where it should be on a tree that is planted at the proper depth. This image here, the tree that's leaning on the left, and then the one on the lower picture shows no flare. Those trees look like a telephone pole going into the ground, and then you can see evidence of circling roots, which you have, and I don't know if you can see my mouse, but you can see this root circling around here. That is a result of a tree being in a plastic container for too long, and those roots grow from the tip. And so what would happen is the roots would spread out until they couldn't anymore, and then they would start circling around the container. If that is not corrected when they're at planting time, they will continue to circle around, and eventually it can girdle a tree. And I saw this tree, there was no significant storm event that had happened. You can see the grass, it's it's in a dormant season. The trees have not leafed out, it just fell over. And that can happen with trees that have had that kind of girdling with the root zone and that conflict between the trunk and the roots. And so, and then furthermore, what has happened in the root zone? Has damage occurred? Like I said, that these roots can spread 3 to 5 times, away from the canopy. So you think you have, a 50-foot spread on a mature tree. Well, that root zone can go up to 150 feet out from that or beyond. And so what has happened in that radius to perhaps influence the tree health? Some signs of rot and decay would be fungal fruiting bodies on the trunk. So you can see here, this would be a sign of something happening inside of the tree. These are of great concern because you can't always manage then what is happening inside of the tree. So you'd want to hire an arborist to get a little better answer about what is going on, where that internal structure might be compromised. Then hollows or cavities in a tree, like you can see on this larger tree here, are equally of concern. That's when bacteria has gotten into the tree and just started to decay from the inside out. And tree biology tells us that the inside of the tree is the structural components. So the inside of the tree, the heartwood, is what is holding up, it's the structure of that tree, the strength of that tree. Around the perimeter of that, under the bark, is the cambium layer. That's the actively growing portion of a tree. Equally as important to protect, like I had talked about earlier with the mulch, protecting that bark and then that growing, that cambium layer from getting damaged. But internally, that structure, once it is decayed, it is lost, it is impossible to replace. And so that is a weak point on the tree. And once there's 40% of a structure is lost, the tree is at significant risk of failing. And you want to look for like splits or cracks or lightning scars. Lightning, the tree that I showed you earlier that were lightning struck, it did, that tree succumbed to that injury quickly. Not all trees will do that, depending on the severity and the intensity of the lightning strike, the species, the overall health and wellness of the tree prior to the lightning strike. And so you want to look for, any sort of cracks or splits or twists or, scars or damage that would have been caused to the trunk of that tree. And then finally, again, like get a certified arborist to assess it if you are uncomfortable with assessing the tree on your own, or you have questions about the health of your tree. And then, structural weakness, I could show you hundreds of pictures of this, but hollows or cavities in a tree, again, can be a sign or a source of decay. Dead wood in a tree, trees do lose branches. It's a natural process, but if it's a large, sizable branch up in the canopy that is at risk of falling on somebody or hurting someone, should be removed. Dead wood is not going to come back or resurrect itself, and so removing that from a tree can help promote health and wellness in the tree. And then again, I said about narrow branch angles. I've got some pictures of those coming up here to really illustrate what that looks like, but those are weak points in a tree. Again, going back, so we're looking at the canopy and the leaves and letting them tell us maybe what is happening with the overall health and wellness of that tree. Species identity is really important. On the left here, we have a pin oak. On the right, we have a catalpa. Both look like they have like that chartreuse kind of color of leaf material. What I would tell you, if you are unfamiliar with these species, is that pin oaks are susceptible to iron chlorosis, which means it's an iron deficiency due to high pH in our soils. We tend to have more alkaline soils in the Midwest, and so in the pin oak, that iron that is essential for tree health development is unavailable to these trees. Now, on the flip side, the catalpa has chartreuse leaves because it has chartreuse leaves. That's a natural color of the leaves of a catalpa, and so the coloration of those leaves is not of concern. On the pin oak, I would suspect that there's some iron deficiencies. So knowing what is normal can help clue you in as to what is going on. Then there's environmental stress. We've talked a little bit about that before, but like drought can really impact how leaves look. There can be curling, there can be, just drying up of leaves, different, it can show up in different ways. It can be spotty if, there's less available water in one portion of the root zone than in another portion of the root zone. And so leaves can give you clues sometimes about what's happening even below ground. Like physical impairment, a tree's growth and development, again, could be an indicator of what is happening in the environment around it. So there might be chemical drift issues, there might be exposure issues, if there's like a cold snap, or if there's something happening, quickly, maybe just on one side of the tree. If it's, a conifer and it's exposed to some really harsh cold winter winds, it might have desiccated, and those leaves would have dried out as opposed to leaves on the other side of the tree. It can tell us a lot about kind of what's happening with that tree, and then the stress that tree might be under. One way to also assess tree growth is looking at the annual growth. And so there's on trees, there's a terminal bud at the end of them. What you can do, and this is a great time of year to do it, is you can go and you can kind of look back and see a differentiation in the bark material. So you've got last year's growth here, and then you've got this year's growth here, and you can kind of tell where that bud broke and sent out these new shoots, but there's a differentiation in that that leaf material, and knowing what species it is, if it's a fast growing species or a slower growing species, and then comparing how much growth occurred in that year can help tell you the overall health and wellness of a tree. You can compare it on a lot of species to then the previous year's growth. You could look back up on the twig and find it'll usually look like little bitty lines, kind of all like right in a little row. And that would be your previous year's growth. So you would have this year's, last year's, and you can look back and see how far that grew. Signs of pests. Pests are often secondary to the main problem. There are exceptions, of course. You know, like we've got here, Japanese beetle on a linden tree. It will stress a tree out. It might cause concern. And if this is one of those cases where this event won't singularly kill the tree, but it can cause stress, and so if it might be compounding other issues that might lead to a diminished health and vigor of that tree. Whereas opposed to the ash tree here on the right-hand side, we do know that emerald ash borer is a threat. It's a fatal threat to ash trees if left untreated. And so this is a classic sign of we've identified it as an ash for starters. And then we know that emerald ash or ash trees respond to emerald ash borer in this way. And so making it more susceptible to storms. It will kill, emerald ash borer will kill an ash tree on its own, but while it's killing the tree, or once the tree is dead and still left in our landscape, that tree becomes a potential hazard for when a storm event takes place. And then potential targets, again, we talked about this, people and property are the targets. We want to make sure that we're protecting each of those. I'm going to go quickly through this. There's a whole bunch of publications. There's a whole presentation that I could do on pruning, but I want to get to talking about how individual storms affect it, and so or affect trees. And so we want to do the correct pruning cuts. That's illustrated here. You want to leave some this branch bark collar on the tree. Flush cuts are recommendations of yesteryear. We don't want to cut straight down the trunk of a tree. If you have a larger branch that needs to be removed, you would want to use this 3-point cutting method here, where you would make your first cut up under the trunk of it, or the branch that you want to remove, and then cut on the outside of it, so you prevent this rip of the bark. That would be, if that were to happen on the trunk of a tree, and I'll show you a picture of that. That can be a point of entry for fungus to start deteriorating the tree. Your third cut on this, in this scenario, would be your final pruning cut. So you'd end up with something just like that. Pruning, so you want to be looking at branch angles. I had said about having a desired branch attachment being wider more than narrower. I think 45 to 90 degrees branch angles are the strongest. So this type of angle is going to be the strongest. A more narrow branch angle is going to be weaker. But you want to make some pruning cuts and pruning decisions to help influence branch development. These are just some examples of trees that are poorly positioned to weather storm events. And so we've got some existing health conditions. This one you can see has 3 leaders. These are all coming from a single trunk. This is a lot of weight material on a very narrow attachment union down at the trunk of the tree. And then here's where that branch, the removal of this branch ripped the bark right there. That would be is a concern. Here we've got this narrow branch angle, and you've got what is called included bark here. That's where the two once at one time smaller branches grew side by side and then grew into each other and had a conflict. And this is a point of weakness. And then here, this is a maintenance thing. We staked the tree or guide the tree, and we never came back and removed it. And so now that rope is impeding the growth of the tree. And at this point, the tree could potentially snap, and that would be that's not desirable. Quickly, this is a tale of a tree that succumbed to a storm. This was in my front yard. So when I bought the property, I told the realtor this tree was going to fail, and unfortunately, I was right. But you could tell because you got like 5 leaders. It was too far past the point of being able to prune to correct tree health, and unfortunately sometimes that happens. But you can see here, you know, we've got this a lot of included bark happening in this you know, crotch angle here. There's even decay matter that's starting to occur inside the tree. This is what it would look like. And then we had a wind event where half of the tree split away from the tree. And this kind of damage to a tree does render it you know, removable. We needed to take down the tree just for the safety. It was not going to recover from that, but you can see the level of decay that had penetrated into that tree from where that decay was being shown earlier in the previous slide. This dark spot, that is all decay inside of that tree. And the weight of the canopy, it just could not tolerate it in a windstorm. Other concerns would be an unbalanced tree. You know, something like this, like I call these Pac-Man trees. There's just a lot of weight on the side of the tree that has not been pruned out to accommodate those power lines. So that would be a concern for wind throw. And then this one too, this tree's got so many concerning issues. You can see it twisted a little bit, but you've got this big giant trunk developed over here to accommodate or to make up for the decay and the dieback that's happened on the primary leader. So this would be kind of offset and is a concern as well. So like I said, right tree in the right place will help lead to resiliency, but then properly planting the tree, watering it, and investing in some pruning while the tree is developing is going to help lead to some resilient trees. Maintenance and the promotion, you know, while the tree is matured, they're just taking care of the tree and protecting it as best we can throughout the life of that tree is going to lead to more resilient trees. Watering during times of dryness, avoiding mechanical damage, avoiding damage to the root systems, avoiding stakes or you know, leaving ties on too long, and then providing mulch, not on the trunk of the tree, but providing mulch can help create resilience trees. But things happen. We know that things happen, and we know that there is a potential for storm events in the Midwest. And so I want to run through a few things to do, you know, with your trees immediately after a storm or after the storm has happened. And so we can take some good action. So first, safety. I cannot say this enough or with enough emphasis. Safety first. Trees are very large pieces of infrastructure in our environment, and they are stunning and they provide a number of benefits, but they are large and heavy, and they can cause a lot of damage and they can cause a lot of injury. So hire a professional arborist if you need to use a chainsaw, if you need to use a ladder to address any sort of storm damage that happened. If there are any utilities in the area, the tree is touching utility lines. If utility lines have come down with a tree, do not touch the tree. Do not go near it. Call an arborist to stay away. Trees can conduct electricity through them. There's moisture content in the trees, and it can be transferred through that live tissue. And so I cannot emphasize that enough. Do not mess with trees that are interacting with power lines. And then if you are questioning whether a tree is worth saving, if you have that much damage, the tree has sustained that much damage, or it looks like it is under that much stress, call an arborist. And then unfortunately, I need to say this, which is to watch out for unscrupulous people or scams in the aftermath of a storm. I've been, you know, in this industry for a very long time, and it is unfortunately not unheard of to have like fly-by-night business people or folks with chainsaws arriving in a community after an event and trying to make a quick dollar. You want to look for certified arborists. So a certified arborist would be willing and able to show you proof of certification as well as insurance. Those would be the two things you want to look for before hiring anybody to work on your trees. Both from a protection of you standpoint, and then also knowing that the person who is going to be working on your tree has all the credentials and knowledge to do that in a wise way. After a tree has fallen, you could stake up or straighten out trees. This tree would not be eligible for that. You could replant essentially smaller trees that have been topped over during a storm event. You want to do it as soon as possible, and you would treat that tree just like it was a newly planted tree. You would do all the things that we talked about earlier, which is water it, mulch it, monitor it, make sure that it is well cared for in the time after replanting. Corrective pruning. If there is damage, you want to make sure that you are removing small, extensively damaged branches, remove any jagged wood or torn wood. From a tree, it's going to seal over better. I want to make a point here and a caveat about oak trees. So you hear a lot of conversation about not pruning oaks during the growing season. That is absolutely recommended. Do not prune oaks if you can avoid it during the growing season. This is to prevent the spread of oak wilt, which is a fatal fungal disease that can be transferred from oak tree to oak tree by insects that are attracted to pheromones that are released when a tree has sustained an injury. And a pruning cut would be still considered an injury from a tree standpoint. Now, the storms don't all happen during the dormant season. So if an oak tree has been damaged in a storm, it has a jagged limb, you could and should smooth out that wound. But what you would want to do within 10 minutes of making that corrective pruning cut would be to apply a latex-based house paint to that wound. Otherwise, you don't need to paint any wounds. That's not, that's not a general statement. That is a very specific recommendation for when you have to prune oak trees during the growing season. And so you want to get that on there quickly. And then also, then pruning out dead, diseased, and damaged limbs out of a tree can help prevent additional damage or additional injury after a storm. Again, that 3-point pruning cut method would be recommended for larger limbs, so the weight of those limbs do not rip the bark and cause more damage than has already been sustained. So that was quickly kind of running through the general tree management recommendations. I want to run through the types of disasters, the types of weather events that we have in the Midwest. Because there's a broad variety of them that we are trying to prepare our trees to withstand or to weather or to survive, there's going to be some overlap. You'll hear me repeat a few things because some of these events are similar in how they impact our trees, but there's enough difference in them that I want to run through them quickly. I also want us to acknowledge what we're asking our trees and the plants in our landscape to tolerate, right? During these events, like we go inside, we try to hunker down, and our trees and our plants cannot do that. And so as your horticulturist, I think it's also just amazing that the plants in our lives can tolerate some of these things as well. So first up, flooding. So in a flood conditions, the soil water holding capacity is exceeded, which means that the soil is full. All of the pore spaces in a soil have been filled up with water. Now this matters because roots of plants need both moisture and air to survive. It might be a little bit counterintuitive to think that the tree roots need air, but they most certainly do. And so when a flood is prolonged in an area, what you can get is called an anaerobic soil condition, which means that there is no moisture, there's no air in that soil, and then that can start causing the roots to die back. So that's one thing to consider. Additionally, in a flood event, there might also be sediment, there might be chemicals or contaminants brought in those flood waters, and then as the floodwaters recede, could be left behind. And so from a tree standpoint and a human health standpoint, it's important to be careful, managing trees, interacting with trees and the soils around trees after a flood, to make sure that you're not getting pesticides, oils, fertilizers, any sorts of runoff or contaminants on you, and then helping your tree to manage those new chemical compounds as well. And then just the motion or the flow of floodwater can weaken trees. So trees that have been submerged in, and soils that have been submerged and soaked in moisture for so long can be really weak. Oftentimes a flood is not the solo storm event that we have, and so it can weaken the ability of that root system to hold the tree up. Structure, stability and structure is part of the root system's job, and so when it has been saturated in a soil, it causes it to be a little softer. A soil condition and wind throw or failure can be a concern. Conversely, erosion can be a concern. Those root systems might just be exposed. If there's fast moving floodwater, it can just wash soil away, and that would be an issue that would need to be addressed. And then tornadoes. So tornadoes are violently rotating columns of air, as defined by the National Weather Service. And now these wind forces can cause immense damage to trees in the direct path of the tornado or outside of it. I've had some experience with some communities who have had tornadoes, and it is not just the path of the tornado that is where you need to assess and consider the damage that trees have sustained. It would be outside of that path, because that wind, the pressure of that wind and the elevated speed of that wind can be beyond just the path of that wind or that tornado. Some of the damage that trees might sustain would be things like breakage. This is really common, of course, with any sort of high wind event. Limbs and trunks can be broken. Hail and pounding rain can also compound the impacts of that wind or the breakage. Trunks can be twisted. Trees could actually be twisted, and you can see this on some trees where they'll be turned, and that can cause some severe damage to the structure, the structural integrity of those trees. They can also be bent. Trees can be bent in a windstorm or in a tornado. Some trees are better able to withstand this than others, and so that would just be an assessment that would need to be done after the event. And then debarking. So the pressure of a wind or the pounding of hail or rain, or the combination of those, can actually remove the bark from a tree, and so that is going to cause some concerning damage to the tree. And then root damage, of course, like I said earlier, we've got the flood. Oftentimes these storms are accompanying each other, or there's a multitude of things that are happening during these storm events. So some root damage could also have occurred. Related to this, but not exactly the same, would be windstorms. So generally speaking, windstorms are less damaging than tornadoes. I know some friends that experienced a derecho a couple of years ago that might disagree with that, but let's set that aside, in that generally it's coming from one direction. So windstorms often have the time or often have the chance to break. They don't do as much twisting as winds, or as tornadoes. Tornadoes have that twisting by just by nature. A tornado would be twisting. Windstorms will often have trunk and limb damage by breakage. Wounds would be this, similar, like the wind bark or the debarking. And then there's wind throw or blowing them over, and so that's when the force of the wind is just too much for the tree to sustain, and so it would snap off at a weak point or completely uproot the tree. Whoop, that went fast. Excuse me. Ice storms, so out of the growing season, when we're in the winter season, so ice accumulation on branches can dramatically increase the weight of the load on these limbs, and snow and ice can put up to 30 times as much weight on the tree, and so this can lead to cracked or broken limbs. Can leave the tree, those limbs, those breakage can leave the tree vulnerable to pests, and so you'd want to assess those as soon as it was safe. Some trees that are smaller will bend under the weight of the tree, and so repeated bending or an ongoing condition can weaken the trunk of the tree, can stress it out, and cause some long-term health impacts. Additionally, if there's not just ice on the trees, it can be these really cold snaps, like extreme cold weather can impact the health of a tree. And so in winters when we have prolonged abnormally cold temperatures, you might see some damage like twig dieback, some branch death, bud damage when trees are starting to emerge or to break bud in the spring. And so that would be a weather-related impact that would present itself later after the event has occurred. And then drought. So unlike some of the other ones we've talked about already, drought is a weather-related disaster that is extended over time, right? One week of not having rain does not qualify as a drought. It would be an extended amount of time that it would show up. And then sometimes, there's short-term and long-term impacts of it. So sometimes the full effect of a drought on a tree or tree species reveals itself over the course of years. And that's where that mitigation or that monitoring really comes to be its full value, is you can watch trees and how they either recover or don't recover over the years after a drought has occurred. To help mitigate drought in your landscape, if you have a beloved tree, providing supplemental water would be the way to do that. This is one of the events that we can actually intervene and try to help trees weather a drought. Now, given that would all depend on the availability of water, of course, but this is one of the only ones that you can actually kind of interfere and interrupt that weather-related disaster. And then finally, pests and pathogens. Of course, we have invasive species, that are affecting our trees. I've already mentioned emerald ash borer. We've also got pathogens like oak wilt that I've already mentioned that impact our trees. And so following guidelines or taking actions to help protect our trees against pests and pathogens can help mitigate those what I consider natural disasters. Are not storm events, but they could certainly impact the health and wellness of our very large trees. I guess also the difference with pest and pathogen is they're species specific generally, and so you would see ash trees being affected. You would see oaks being affected. Tornadoes do not discriminate. They will go after and impact every species that is in that community. Generally, pests and pathogens do not do that. They're more specific, and so that's one way that they are a little bit different from our other natural disasters. They're also a little more slow moving, but they're widespread, so it will affect like a whole region. Similar to drought, but they will move slowly. And then there's a strong human influence, and so that movement can also be related to human movement. Like emerald ash borer was primarily spread by human transport, and so a little bit different, but I think something to keep in mind as we look to manage our trees. So finally, just a few takeaway messages here before we wrap up. Proper care before a storm can create healthy, resilient trees. It is the best way to help our trees withstand and prepare for the myriad of stressful events that they may encounter during their lives. This includes doing an assessment of your trees and taking action to help mitigate anything that is of concern, and taking preventative measures. And then finding a good certified arborist. I put this website on here, treesaregood.org. That's a good way you can find arborists in your area. Certified arborists are listed on there. You can search by county, by city, by state. And so it's a really handy tool to find an arborist. I would recommend getting to know some of these folks ahead of time, putting their phone number in your phone. And so if something were to happen, that is one less thing that you need to be concerned about after a storm event has happened, after you've experienced this stressful event. You have it ready to go, and you can call them when you are ready, depending on the situation. Being in communication with an arborist is going to help you prepare. And so then again, after the storm, like, call that professional. If you know them and you've been working with them, so you're going to probably move up on their list as in terms of who they're going to respond to first. Perhaps they are familiar with your trees, and they could talk to you about some measures that could be taken. So just building a relationship with those arborists is recommended. Then safety first. Safety first. Again, do not go near trees that have are touching or are interacting with any sort of power lines. Do not try to prune trees if they are bent, or there's a lot of weight that is in and on these canopies, especially during the growing season. There's there's a lot of potential for damage, and so it is recommended just to call a professional. And I say damage like to you or to others around you. Like it can be quite a serious situation. So please be safe. And then again, like monitor your trees afterwards and then replant. I had said earlier, trees are a critical component of our landscapes and worth the investment of time and resource. And so after a storm, I think it's important to, when we're all ready emotionally and the landscape is ready physically, to replant some trees in our landscape. And so with that, turn it back over to Russell.
Okay, well, thank you. That was great information, Emily. We have a couple questions, and before we get to those, I just want to point out that next Monday, we have Kamaya Wallace-Bichard, who's our consumer economics educator. She'll be presenting from noon to 1 p.m. on financial emergency preparedness. And that is the last of our webinars as part of the disaster preparedness series. If you haven't registered yet, you can do so by going to go.illinois.edu/be prepared. Again, if you cannot attend any of the live sessions, recordings for the series will be sent out to everyone that registers, and those recordings will go out in September. And there's also a survey that I just put in the chat. If you have some time, please fill that out. That helps us determining our programming. And I'll just go over the questions real quick.
Okay.
That I saw. Sandra asked, how does a person correct the circling roots?
Yeah, that's a great question. So thank you for that. At the time of planting, what you would do, so if you're planting a tree and you start seeing those roots circle, you would perform a cut or a number of cuts to those root systems. And I'll acknowledge this is hard to do when you've invested some resource into a tree. But the best thing you could do would be to stop those roots from circling. And so depending on the severity of the girdling roots, you would perform what's called a box cut. And so you would take a saw. I use a different hand saw than I use for pruning the canopy. It is hard on your saw, and so you'd want to use one that is designated for pruning root system. But you would just form it into a box shape, cut straight down the sides of it. You would have 4 sides that you would form. Another method you could do would be to cut into the root system and break those roots from circling. By the end of it, your root ball is kind of a mess, but that's okay because you want those roots to be growing out into the soil that you're planting your tree into, as opposed to staying within that planting hole and then continuing to circle around. Now, if you have circling roots on an established tree, there's a couple of things you could do. You could cut those roots. You could take a saw and cut those, especially like the one that we saw there where you can see the root above ground. That's not always the case. And so this is where you could hire a arborist who has access to an air spade is what it's called. And this is a really neat tool where it is used pressurized air to actually remove or excavate soil around the root system. And then you could make some cuts, or the arborist could make some cuts on that root system without causing extensive damage to the root system, because you're removing it with that pressurized air. But that's a more specialized tool. It is best to address when we're planting trees, but I know that that's not always the case.
Okay, Emily, another question on the slide, signs of structural weakness. It appeared there was some weeping on a tree coming down. What might cause that? And is there a correction that can be made?
Yeah, so let me go back to that. Let me see if I can get back to it. This is often like a sign of some sort of like fungal, I'll get into it, sorry. Oh, it's trying to get there. Here we go. Oh, up here, I'm guessing, or no, that's structural weakness signs.
Yeah, that was the right slide.
The other side. Okay. So, like things like up here. So there are trees. there are some species of trees that bleed more. I put that in quotes. Where the sap just runs out of them more when there's an injury. It also depends on the time of year when that wound is made, where the tree is just going to have some sap run out of it. If that is what is happening, that is not a major concern. That is just the tree was sending sap to that branch, and it is no longer sending sap to that branch. It is sending it outside of that tree, and it will stop. It will stop itself as it starts to seal over. Now, there are some fungal diseases that can occur in that cambium layer right underneath the bark, and they will present themselves, or you can start seeing signs of it as like black spots. The bark can start turning black. It can have some oozing occur. Those would be the signs of that fungal infection. Now, is there a correction that can be made? Not oftentimes would be the answer to that. If it is that fungal infection. And so depending on the species, but oftentimes depending on where that's at on the tree and the severity of it, I would consult an arborist and get some more specific, address it more specifically on a one-on-one basis.
Okay, thank you, Emily. That was the last question I see in our chat. So this concludes our presentation today. Hope to see you next Monday. If anyone has any other questions and want to put them in chat or unmute yourself and ask, we'll stick around for a couple more minutes. But otherwise, thanks and have a great day.